Hello, thanks for joining us today. Today I'm going to talk with Judith Mank, who is the head editor at Evolution Letters. And we're going to talk about the growing role of AI and large language models in scientific publishing. Judith recently wrote a nice editorial about the different ways that researchers are using LLMs in their scientific work and scientific publishing. And she goes into deeper questions about their use and how the questions that they raise about accountability, transparency, voice, as well as trust in science. Before we start talking about LLMs, Judith, tell us a little bit about who you are as a researcher and a bit about your role as head editor at Evolution Letters.
Thanks. So first off, thanks for doing this. It's really nice to be here. So I'm Judith Mank. I study evolutionary genomics focused on questions about sexual selection, sex chromosome evolution. A lot of what we do is focused on guppies behind me, but we work on a whole range of animals and with collaborators, non-animals as well. I'm also the editor, as you said, of Evolution Letters, which is a journal, I should point out, which is owned jointly by the Society for the Study of Evolution and the European Society of Evolutionary Biology. And our goal as a journal is to publish exciting, impactful research in all fields of evolutionary biology. So send us your exciting stuff.
First question, what prompted you to write this editorial about LLMs, large language models, and their use in scientific publishing?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, when things like ChatGPT and Gemini first launched, I gave it a try and I tested it out by asking it questions that I knew the answers to, so I could test it. And in almost every question I asked it, it was about 70% right and about 30% completely hallucinated. And I thought it was funny. It was like a comedy of errors, to be honest. And when I would push it on those things, it more often than not would double down and tell me I was wrong. And so I thought, this is interesting, but I don't need to mess with it. And then a little while after that, I heard about a couple universities where whole faculties had banned the use of LLMs by their students. They had to sign statements that they weren't using it unless they were given explicit permission to study them as part of their work. And I heard about a couple colleagues saying that they had banned everyone in their lab from using them and were refusing to sit on graduate committees if the student would not attest to not using them. And I thought, maybe I've missed something here. Maybe they are. And so I thought, there seems to be a lot of suspicion about what's going on and what people are doing. Maybe I should ask people what they're doing. And so that's where this came from. We also had a couple things happen at the journal where authors were worried that reviewers had used LLMs in review, and a couple reviewers were worried that authors had used LLMs in irresponsible ways. Turned out everything was fine, but it was very clear that there was a huge amount of suspicion in the field at the moment. And so I just started talking to people about how they were using it and what their views were on it. And that's where the editorial ultimately came from.
That's great. So given those discussions, you describe the many productive everyday uses of LLMs from researchers, from coding, polishing language. Where do you see the clearest benefits are for using this as a tool?
Yeah, those two things particularly. So a lot of people are using LLMs for coding, and I think it's fantastic in that context. You still have to check that it works, and you have to check that it's appropriate, but it's, in my mind, in many ways, it's similar to searching through GitHub for bits of code or asking. A lot of people just used to Google these things. And so it's not that different. You still have to check it. I have talked to several people who are not as comfortable in English, and it's incredibly helpful for them. So in almost every context where we talked about it, they would write the material, they would write the first draft. And I think that's the key bit. You have to create the material that it then edits and works from. But then they could run that through ChatGPT and ask for it to clarify and correct things. And it really reduced a lot of the cognitive burden of operating in a language you're not super comfortable with. And I think that's great.
Yeah.
People were using it in other ways. I think it was amazing how widely it has permeated what we do. I think those were the two most productive ones that I kept hearing over, and the two that I think are probably the most valuable at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. So a major theme in your editorial is about accountability.
Yeah.
So what do you think responsible AI use means?
Yeah. So ultimately, it boils down to I'm talking about a publishing context, right? Ultimately, having your name on a paper means that you are accountable for it, right? And we can't have an AI chatbot as an author. And so anything that you use it for, you have to ultimately take accountability for. It hasn't changed your meeting, or the code that you get is appropriate. All of those things you ultimately need accountability for. And we need to be able to trust the authors that they checked all these things. And that's where I think over-reliance, people are very suspicious that authors or reviewers are becoming over-reliant on these things and then they are no longer accountable for it. I suspect that's not the case as much as people suspect, but there always is that danger.
Yeah. As I was preparing for our chat today, I watched a video from a couple people associated with COPE, Professional Ethics in Publishing. And what struck me was that they talked about how originally the concerns with LLMs in scientific publishing was like, are the people actually writing their work? Right?
Yeah.
Is this coming from you? And now the concern really has moved, or the needle has moved more to reviewers. So are reviewers actually doing the work and not posting them on, not uploading the paper on something that's open like ChatGPT or Gemini. And I wanted to ask about this. I'm going a little bit off script, but I wanted to ask you about a distinction that was made in that discussion where one of the podcasters said originally the agreement was no one should use AI or ChatGPT at all in reviewing. And then a little bit of nuance has snuck in where if you're using a closed system, so you're using proprietary software, that it's if you're writing the review and using it for editing so that your work comes across more cleanly to the editor and to the authors, they don't really see too much of a problem with that. Is that your take as well?
So I should say that this is my personal opinion. And when you talk to people, there's a huge range of opinions about using these tools, from people who object to using them at all to people who say we should offload reviewing entirely to them. So I think the middle ground is probably where we're going to end up, in exactly as you say. Yes, there's a major breach of confidentiality and trust in the whole process if you simply upload a paper to ChatGPT or any other proprietary open system where you have no control over where the data goes afterwards, and then use that simply to write your review. I think, one, there's a confidentiality issue. Additionally, these things are trained on basically the existing body of written information in the world. And that means that they're going to go toward sort of the most common word order, right? That means that they converge to a middle ground. They will lack the specialist knowledge that we actually need the reviewers to give us. And they will give you a sort of a general, quite vague review. So it's not a very effective review. You also have very little control over how those companies use that information. So it's a breach of confidentiality. And it's also a breach of the whole reason we have expert reviewers. That expertise is not there. And so when you agree to review a paper, we ask you, everyone listening, and I know you review as well a lot, to lend us their specific expertise. And the LLMs just don't have that. So I tend to agree that it's completely unacceptable to just rely on, at this point, LLMs to review our papers. I have personally no problem with people writing their review and using chatbots to edit them, especially because it can make it more effective in conveying their intent. We've all, I'm sure, gotten reviews where we're really a little bit unsure about what the reviewer wants. Yeah. And I think if we can sharpen that, if you can use tools to sharpen, that's a more effective review, and that's great. And that's really not a breach of confidentiality.
Okay. So just a quick follow-up. So if I were writing a review and I wrote it myself, and then I used AI to help me edit it, perfect it, I would still want to put it in a closed system because can you make that distinction there?
Yeah. So it really depends on how you're using AI to do it. So if you're really just giving it a couple sentences or a little bit of information that is not revealing about the paper, I think it's acceptable to use the standard systems. Not everyone has access to a closed system.
I see.
And so there is an accessibility issue as well. If you are trying to upload your entire review that may be quite revealing, that I would be very concerned about. So it's really how you use it. I think if you're using it in that latter context, you would want to use a system where it's closed, where when you shut that chat down, the information is immediately deleted.
Yeah, so I can see like a general guideline coming from this. You don't want to breach confidentiality that you're agreeing to when you take on a review. And also, if you hold to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done to you, I think that could probably be a guiding
Yeah,
way to think about it.
absolutely. Yeah. And the thing is that all reviewers are also authors in a different
Right.
context. And so, exactly, the golden rule holds there. We all want effective, constructive reviews. But we also want to make sure that our information isn't being used in concerning ways. Absolutely.
Right. So your editorial, you also talk about transparency and acknowledgement of AI use, and you note that there's some nuance around this. So can you talk about when you think disclosure feels more straightforward versus when it gets more complicated? What would you want to see in an acknowledgement statement or a statement saying, transparency statement, I think?
Yeah. So this one, I think we're in a time of really rapid change. And because there is this suspicion right now, we need to be extra careful about transparency. I suspect that these things will become normalized very soon and it will not be so much of an issue. At this point, I think it's fair to say it would be best for people to be very clear anytime they use it. Just say it in the acknowledgements. If it was just for text editing or for coding or whatever, it's relatively straightforward. That I don't think there's any ethical concern, and I suspect that will not be an issue going forward because in many ways, those are just extensions of how we already use computers. So we use autocorrect in Word or Google Docs to fix things. This is just, if you're using it for language editing, this is an extension of that, especially if you write the first draft. If you're using it for coding, it's not that different from Googling or searching through GitHub for bits of code to string together. It's an extension of that, and accountability stays the same. When you're using it for more than that, I think you need to be really clear. And partly that's there is this incredible suspicion right now. I feel like, I said this a couple of times, I feel like LLMs are a little bit like Ozempic. A lot of people are using it, and a lot of people are suspecting that everyone's using it, and we're not sure what's going on, but nobody's talking about it. And so that was the goal of the editorial. We need to talk about it. We need to normalize this. We need to figure out what's okay. Right. We need to remove a little bit of the stigma of it. And I think transparency is the way to do that. So I would, at this point, say whenever you use it, that will kill the stigma, any stigma associated with it, and make it really clear how broadly applicable these things are. I suspect in a few years that will no longer be necessary. But in the moment of transition, it's helpful to just be very clear what's going on.
So there's a couple of things that I worry on. There's more than a couple of things I worry on when it comes to the use of LLMs, both broadly as well as personally. Yeah. One is a pillar that you raised in the editorial, which is your voice. Yeah. So why is preserving your individual voice as an author so important in scientific writing, especially as these AI tools become more sophisticated?
Yeah, so I feel like our job is, in a paper, is to take information, synthesize it into a cohesive narrative, and convey it in a way that, at this point, humans can understand. And to tell, I don't want to say tell a story because that sounds like you're fabricating, but you're not. You're creating a narrative around data to explain how things work. That is the voice. That's your perspective. That's your point of view. And that needs to be maintained. Otherwise, you're really just describing things and not synthesizing them in a cohesive way. And it becomes, if you're not careful when you use these things, it can make all the output very vague and lack that clear narrative arc of pulling these things together. And I worry that if we become too reliant on these things, that everything sort of converges toward this sort of descriptive, I don't want to say mediocrity, but it lacks the sort of innovation and synthesis that is our job as scientists. Like, we are here to move the field forward, to synthesize information and advance on it. And because LLMs are trained on what exists, they tend to stay in that space. They're not going to move things forward. And so I think voice is really important to maintain in these things. As long as your intent is maintained, then I think it's acceptable use. If you're over-reliant on that, then it becomes a real problem.
And especially when you're thinking about teaching trainees to write and how to write how to make that phrase very crystalline so people can understand what you're trying to say. And if you're using LLMs that you're not thinking deeply about how to build analogies. So I think that's one thing that I'm concerned about, is how to continue to train trainees to maintain their voice or develop their voice. And then for me, I've used it editorially, written my paper, and then used it to make sure people can understand what I'm trying to say. So I felt like that's okay. But then I worry about what am I losing by taking away that editorial step from myself,
Yeah.
right?
I've grappled with this too. So for me, writing is how I order things. Like
Right.
writing is the act of writing for me is actually, it's not a learning experience, it's a synthesis experience.
Right.
So that's how I pull all the things together. It's when I see holes in papers because I'm writing and I see the gap that I might
Right.
not have noticed otherwise. I have to think very carefully through things as I write. And for me, and I think this may be a generational thing. For me, the act of writing is how I think about how I do things. Like I design projects around the idea of this is how we're going to create a paper. This is a unit that is publishable. But learning to write is hard.
Mhm.
It's really hard. And it takes a certain amount of practice to build out the muscle memory about how you do it, to understand your own process, because everyone differs. And I can see the appeal of offloading that to an LLM. And we know that sort of cognitive offloading is not good.
Right.
People learn less, they retain less when they
Right.
don't go through that struggle. So I agree with you. I have concerns about that. I really encourage everyone that is learning to write to still write that first draft, to think very carefully and write that draft. For me, I like mentally outline the order of things and I write it in prose. People work differently, but I think that act of getting the first draft down is really important for learning and thinking through your narrative, as I talked about. And it's also really important for preserving the voice. If you're going to use LLMs further down the road, you need to understand what your point is. That may be a collaborative process in the future with LLMs. People may incorporate them in that process. I don't really know. I think everyone's going to be different. And this is
Right.
going to evolve very quickly. But I think that first draft still remains very important. If you then want to use LLMs to improve the flow of a paper, change the tone, sometimes I found it's very helpful in that context. I think that's entirely acceptable as long as you have your starting material and you know what you want to say. I think that's the key bit that I maintain. I suspect we will end up, I don't want to make predictions because they're not going to age well, but I suspect people will be more comfortable with these things and they will find something that works for them.
I think right now I'm trying to think of the use of LLMs as I have a screwdriver and I'm using the screwdriver with my hand.
Exactly.
I'm not using it as a crutch.
Yeah, absolutely. I use it as a tool to improve things. I don't use it as a tool to not do things. I still do the work, but I want to make it better. I think that's entirely acceptable as a tool. Exactly. But it's not the only thing there. Yeah.
So if you had to rank your biggest concerns about LLMs in publishing, what rises to the top? Are there any red flags that you think are deserving of more discussion?
Yeah. So I have concerns about what we were talking about, people using it too much, because that's a fuzzy line and it will differ for people. And it's very hard to say this is okay and this is not. That's really difficult. There are things about writing and the whole publishing process that are hard and there are bottlenecks. And I've been a little bit concerned that people are suggesting that we should offload reviewing to
Oh, yeah.
LLMs entirely. There are some new systems that are meant to do this. And I think they have a lot of value at finding really clear issues. They lack, when I've played with them, they lack the sort of species specific expertise to make clear recommendations or to pick up problems, assumptions that are incorrect about the species that's being used or something like that. So I would be really worried if we just offload all reviewing. And I would argue we need to be, people talk about the reviewing crisis, that for some journals and some types of papers, it's really hard to secure reviewers. I would argue that there's too many papers at the moment. People are publishing ever smaller pieces of information and it lacks that synthesis. And if we use LLMs to accelerate that process, that's not good. I would argue that we need to be publishing more synthetic, meatier papers. And that's not something that LLMs are inherently good at.
Exactly. A couple of things that I wanted to bring up that I know you're probably concerned about as well. One is scraping people's information that they didn't give permission for. And then also the environmental concerns, right?
Yeah.
So I looked into this a little bit. I don't know if you've heard of the podcast Science Versus. It's a real fun podcast, right? They talk to researchers, they read the literature about particular issues, and they took on the use of ChatGPT and its environmental impact. And their summary was effectively, from talking to people and from doing the reading, was one, chat prompt is the same as about 10 Googles when it comes to environmental impact. But where we really are making a dent is developing videos.
Yeah.
So if you use
Yeah.
ChatGPT to generate videos, that uses
Yeah.
a ton of energy.
Yeah.
And so I've used that as a guiding reasoning for, okay, I'm not going to use ChatGPT or any LLM to, one, generate figures because I enjoy doing that,
Yeah.
and two, generate videos because
Yeah.
I don't want to have a huge environmental footprint.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And this is something that we all have to navigate through, but it's something that we all have to navigate through in other aspects of our life. Like
Mm-hmm.
the environmental cost of flying is very high. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And you're absolutely right. It's important to think through these things and to come up with something that you feel comfortable with that is responsible. The scraping of data is a concern, and I don't know what to do about that, to be honest. On one hand, I don't want to say that it's inevitable, we can't do anything about it, that these companies are going to do that, because that's not very effective. On the other hand, the alternative is that we create like synthetic data to train it on. And that I find deeply worrying. They're now generating synthetic data to train these LLMs on it. It occurs to me that if there's an issue early on in that sort of generation, that just gets propagated through the system and you'll suffer from it forever. So I don't know what the answer is to that. I don't have a good answer. And I think that's why some people, when I talk to them, some of the people I talked to who were completely against these things were against it for the intellectual reasons you talk about. Others were against it because of the ethical and environmental costs. And I think those are absolutely legit things that we need to talk through. And then we need to understand. It may be that we end up having to pay for these things, almost like a carbon tax, that may make people a little bit more thoughtful. At some point, the model will have to shift to make it more clear what the costs are.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So we've already talked about concerns about the use of LLMs in peer review, particularly around confidentiality and trust. Can you just outline what reviewers absolutely should not be doing when it comes to the use of AI tools?
They should not be offloading effort to the AI tools. Like, it's fine for wordsmithing a little bit, for clarifying and improving your review. They should not be uploading a paper to an open system. They should be writing their review, absolutely, and using their expertise to do that. They shouldn't be offloading that to the LLM. They should be doing the review. We want them for their expertise. That's why we contacted them. Yeah. And so I have no problem with them using LLMs to improve or clarify their review, to make it easier for the authors. At its best, a review is a really constructive series of suggestions to improve a paper. It's a conversation, albeit a bit awkward and through intermediaries, between reviewers and authors about how to make the paper better. And that's why we contact people to be reviewers. We want them to help us make the work better. And I don't think at this point LLMs are they can't do that. They don't have that ability, that insight, and that critical knowledge in those places.
Right. We certainly don't want them to have that ability.
Yeah. It depends. Some people do, but I'm with you on this one.
Right.
Yeah.
So are there uses of LLMs in research or writing that you feel cross a line, even if they're not explicitly prohibited yet?
Yeah, I suspect people are using LLMs to write some of their application materials for academic jobs. And I'm quite concerned about that. I suspect, as I said, when you do this, if you're not very specific in your prompts, you get the same output. And so everyone sort of converges toward this mean. But that may actually make people who have a unique voice stand out more. So it may actually help those people who don't use it or are very careful in how they use it. So I suspect that will be pretty evident pretty quick and people will be on the alert for that. But for academic jobs, we're so specialized. To offload that to an LLM really erodes that special aspect about a person and their expertise. And I don't think it helps them, but we don't at this point have guidance about it. I think when we have gotten at the journal submissions that are very clearly generated by AI and with a very non-specific prompt. And it's very clear that that's not okay first, but we're pretty good at picking those up. They never make it to review. It's not a problem. Mm-hmm. At this point, I don't think that we can rely on these things to write papers for us in any real meaningful way. But that is not good. We shouldn't be doing that. But at this point, we can police it. I would be concerned that people do offload too much of the human element on these things.
Right.
That line is very fuzzy. We all have to navigate that together, though. That was part of the point of the review. Like, we got to start talking about this rather than just suspecting what people are doing, so that we can come to a meaningful set of guidelines.
And one of the discussions from the people on the COPE video that I was watching, she gave some pointers for editors and how to reach out if you think an author is using the LLMs. Approach them with grace and
100%.
Right.
Yeah, and I think right now I've had a couple interactions where someone was suspecting either author or reviewer was using these things inappropriately. They came in a little hot, I'll be honest. And I think in that context, it was really helpful to be that filter, to say, then contact the people where there were these concerns and say, this has been raised, but I give you an opportunity to talk about it, not to assume that they were doing something nefarious. I agree. I think we need to give people a lot of grace. I'll be really honest. Like, people are really concerned about AI slop. Humans make mistakes too. We're not infallible. Assuming that a mistake in a paper or review or something like that is the result of inappropriate use of LLMs kind of puts humans on this impossible pedestal. Humans make mistakes. And I think we need to assume that's the first thing. And we give people a chance to explain or figure out what's going on and then go from there. Yeah, no, I think we need to be very careful because, as I said, there is this incredible suspicion and a little bit of maybe attempts to shame that are a bit inappropriate at this point.
Right. Yeah. As an author and a researcher, consider very carefully how you're using these LLMs so that you don't shortchange yourself moving forward. And then as a reviewer, editor, associate editor, whatever.
Or reader. Even just a reader of a paper. Yeah. Give people a lot of grace.
Approach it with grace. One of the things that just really pisses me off, to be honest, is the discussion about how LLMs use M dashes all the time. I have always and loved M dashes. It's like my
bullet points. Right? Bullet points. I love them in all sorts of contexts because they just make life so much easier. And there's another thing that is, I think M dashes are gone now from LLMs. They've decided that's the cue. But they have a cadence that they tend to respond in groups of 3. And the reason they do that is because 3 is a little bit of a magic number for humans. 2 is too few, 4 is too many, 3 is a little bit magical. I've used 3, group things into 3 forever because it is a bit of a magical number. So don't assume that if the LLM does these things, that it's the result of an LLM, because they were trained on data from humans who do these things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
Final question, stepping back, how do you see journals like Evolution Letters helping the community navigate AI use going forward? What role can editors more broadly, realistically play as these tools continue to evolve? Because it's a changing landscape, right?
Yeah, and when I was starting to talk to people about this, there was a fair number of people who said we should just have a checkbox. Authors could just check a box if they used it or not, or how they used it, and reviewers could do the same. And I pushed back against it for a couple of reasons. One, as an author, I hate checkboxes. I hate them. It's like, I find them not very helpful, and I want to stop adding pieces of work that stand between an author and them submitting their work to us. Because, sometimes it could just take days to actually get a paper uploaded for review. And 2, I think it's not very effective because we can't possibly imagine all the ways that people are using AI in these things and have a series of checkboxes to do it. So it's going to be a very vague thing. Did you use it? Yes. What does that mean? So I didn't find that very helpful. And I also was a little bit concerned that if we spent a lot of time reviewing our guidance notes to authors and reviewers, that we'd have to update that almost weekly because the field is changing. And so I think our job is to keep on top of what the latest tools are, understand how they work and their capabilities, have the conversation. I think we need to accept that people are using it. It's not going to be possible at this point to ban it, except that some uses cannot be policed. We cannot enforce our rules, that we have community standards, but we have to understand that we need to be on the lookout for when people break those and think about it, but we can't really police it. Sometimes we may not know. And so you have to be very careful about it. My goal with the editorial was to start that conversation with the community so that we can accept that there is reasonable use and determine what that reasonable use is, and to help people coming up, new people coming in, young people who are trying to navigate this, understand what their job is, what's okay and what's not. I think that's what our job is to be on the lookout for new things, not in a bad way, but what's coming up. Some things may be very useful.
Right.
Some things may not be, and understand the capabilities and limitations, and to help people understand what they can and can't do, or what they should and shouldn't do. I shouldn't use can because people can do anything. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judith. I think that's the end of my questions, and I really appreciate your time in this discussion and helping me to clarify, and actually reading your editorial prompted me to think about these issues. So I really appreciate you writing that.
But I feel like my job is done. If one person made it, that's awesome.